Welcome to this meeting of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. Today is the first in a new series of talks and discussions on the theme of power, legitimacy and influence in the future of Asia. In it, we will be looking at the place and impact of a group of key Asian leaders who seem to mark significant pivot points in their own country's story and whose impact is felt across the continent. Over the next 12 months, we'll be looking at Narendra Modi, Mohammed bin Salman and Xi Jinping, among others. But today, we begin with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whose impact on Turkey has been profound since he first became Prime Minister in 2003 and President in 2014. We're very fortunate to have an outstanding panel today. Dr. James Ryan is our guest moderator, and I will leave other introductions to him, except to say welcome back to Hannah Lucinda Smith, who last spoke to the Society in May 2021 in an event with Sir John Golden. James is the Executive Director of the Middle East Research and Information Project at the University of Pennsylvania and was previously Director of Research and the Middle East Programme at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And with that, I will say, James, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and also to Charlie Portlock for doing a lot of behind-the-scenes organization of this group. It's really great to be here with everyone, and for a really, I think, quite timely conversation with three really fantastic people to have it with. So in the interest of getting things started here, I'm going to introduce our three panelists right off the top. And in the order that they will speak, we're going to have a conversation today structured around the role of Islam and nationalism and Islamic nationalism in Turkey under Erdogan's rule of the last two plus decades at this point. And each of our presenters will speak for about 10 minutes to lay some groundwork and their perspective, and we'll have a conversation ongoing from there. I encourage folks to pop a question into the Q&A box whenever they feel like, and I'll be reading those back to the panelists when we reach that point. So our panelists today, we'll begin with Professor Jenny White. She is a writer and social anthropologist who has been specializing in Turkey for several decades. And in 2016, or since 2016, she has been a professor at Stockholm University's Institute for Turkish Studies and was formerly the president of the Turkish Studies Association, which is now the Ottoman Turkish Studies Association, of which I am also the executive director. So I have great thanks for Jenny's service to these august institutions over the years. She has published several books on contemporary Turkey, including most recently Turkish Kaleidoscope, which is a fantastic graphic novel that depicts the political and social turmoil of Turkey in the 1970s and 1980s, as well as Muslim nationalists and the New Turks and Islamist mobilization in Turkey, two books very, very important for the discussion that we're about to have today. Our second speaker is going to be Sebnem. I should also say Professor White, of course, joins us from Stockholm. Our second speaker will be Sebnem Gumuscu, who is an associate professor of political science at Middlebury College in Vermont, though she is joining us from sabbatical in Istanbul and near Umraniye. Thank you so much for joining us on your research leave. I know that's an extra imposition. Professor Gumuscu is a scholar who focuses on political parties, democratization, democratic backsliding, political Islam, and Middle Eastern politics. Her first book, which was co-authored with the late, great Fuat Kemal, was entitled Democracy, Identity, and Foreign Policy in Turkey, which examines Turkey's transformation under the AKP since 2002. And her most recent book, Democracy or Authoritarianism, Islamist Governments in Turkey, Egypt, and Tunisia, focuses on Islamist parties and their democratic commitments when in power. Thanks for being with us, Sebnem. And lastly, as mentioned before, our final panelist is Hannah Lucinda Smith, is a journalist who has been based in Turkey since 2013, reporting across the Middle East and Europe for the Times of London, The Atlantic, Wired, and many others, as well as covering all the major events in Turkey over the past decade. She has reported from inside rebel-held Syria, Afghanistan, and under the Taliban, and invested cryptocurrency and sanctions busting in the former Soviet Union. Smith is the author of Erdogan Rising, The Battle for the Soul of Turkey, an account of the Turkish president's path to autocracy, and Zarifa, a women's battle in a man's world, written with the Afghan former mayor and human rights activist Zarifa Ghaffari. Hannah is also joining us from Istanbul as well. Welcome to all three of you. And I will now pass things over to Jenny White, who's going to give us really set our table for us. What is Muslim nationalism? How do you feel, or have you seen Islam and nationalism shape politics over the last 2 decades under Erdogan?
Thank you, James. I'm actually not going to get to how it'll be shaping politics, because I wouldn't want to take anything away from the next two speakers, but I will set the scene. My task was to talk about what is the relationship between Islam and nationalism in Turkey. And I'm going to do this by separating Islam and nationalism and then putting it together in different ways in order to illustrate changes in the formulation of Turkish national identity over time. And what I'll be asking that is relevant is, what does it mean to be a Turk, and how has that changed? And then how has being Muslim fit into that, right? So to answer that, I'm going to start at the beginning and at the Ottoman Empire. So in 10 minutes, we're going to zoom to the present. But the reason I'm starting with the Ottoman Empire is because I want you who are listening to kind of look for comparisons as I go on. So the Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire governed by a sultan with absolute power. From the 16th century on, the sultan was also the caliph, that is, the leader of the entire Muslim world. The state had supremacy over religion and managed it through a variety of institutions. Non-Muslim ethno-religious communities were organized as millet, in a millet system with their own representatives, autonomous courts, and special tax. This empire was dismembered after World War I, and what survived under Turkish rule was a republic founded in 1923 under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And at the time, there were several competing definitions in the air about what the Turkish nation and Turkishness should be. And one of them was a suggestion that Turkish identity should be a supranational, non-ethnic, non-racial identity that included Muslim ethnic groups in Eurasia, for example, the Turkic world. The primary unifying elements were culture, language, and Islam. They were all Muslims. But the identity that won out was what came to be called Kemalist nationalism. And Kemalism recognized two categories of Turk. One of them is Turk by nationality. The other is Turk by citizenship. So Turks by nationality was based on Turkish blood and lineage in Turkish soy. So soy was a very often used word to talk about this, as well as blood, and as well as being a Sunni Muslim. So it was blood and religion. What was interesting was that piety was not required. Islam was a marker of identity, not a belief system or a lifestyle in the context of national identity. So Turks could live a secular lifestyle, not even know how to pray, which is not unusual in a nation that had replaced Islam with secular education. But still firmly believe that one has to be Muslim to be Turkish. So the second category, Turks by citizenship, referred to non-Muslims within Republican boundaries. Since they were Turkish citizens, but not Turks, their patriotism and loyalty were continuously suspect. So from the beginning, Islam was part of Turkish national identity. But Kemalists believed that Islam as a belief system and Islamic institutions actually hindered national progress. So in consequence, the state outlawed religious orders, abolished the caliphate, banned all religious symbols in public, and religion was removed as a source of legitimacy for the state, replaced by sovereignty of the people. The Ottoman Empire itself was associated with a corrupt Islam, so its place in national history was erased. Now, how do you square this with the central position of Sunni Islam in Kemalist national identity? Well, a main pillar in Republican national identity was laicism, or laiklik in Turkish, which is often translated as secularism, which is not exactly the case. It means state control and support of religion, specifically Sunni Islam, not other variants, through the Ministry of Religious Affairs, or the Diyanet. Now, the employees of Diyanet were civil servants, and they wrote the Friday sermons for all the mosques in the country. They promoted religious values similar to Republican values. Good Muslims act like good citizens. The aim was to produce a nationalized civic Islam, purified from superstition, fanaticism, and particularly from Arab culture, to create a kind of superior Turkish Islam. But what was sacred was not religion, but the nation state. Securing the survival and unity of the nation state meant everything. It meant maintaining racial unity, Turkish blood and lineage, and defending Turkey's 1923 borders against the Christian West, which was assumed to be trying to undermine that unity as they had done in World War I. There's a Turkish saying that defines that period: Turks have no friends but Turks. So the Kemalists were voted out of office in 1950 in the first multi-party elections, but retained control of the state, the military, education, and so on. So laicism remains central. But the newly elected political parties pandered to the Islamic part of national identity, to the great discomfort of Kemalists. The 1960s and 70s were characterized by violent struggles between left and right, ending with a coup in 1980. In the 1980s, the military, together with the post-coup government of Turgut Özal, decided that a controlled appeal to an Islamic nationalism would keep youth from succumbing to communism. So they promoted something that came to be called the Turkish Islamic synthesis, which loosened the reins on Islamic education. Now, the Turkish Islamic synthesis supported modernization, economic liberalism, but insisted that these should be based on Muslim ethics. And the focus was on an authentic Turkishness, still rooted in blood, but also in history. So the Ottoman Empire was rehabilitated as a basis for authentic Turkishness. The more liberal economy of the 1980s allowed the rise of these pious provincial elites in business and politics. And Islamist parties began to win elections. So the AKP under Erdogan has been in power since 2002. This new self-consciously pious Muslim political and economic elite have developed an alternative definition of Turkishness that I call Muslim nationalism, that differs substantially from previous definitions of Turkish identity, different enough to be hailed as the new Turkey. I'm not sure I should be saying Türkiye, the new Turkey. Erdogan's new Turkey bases national identity on Sunni Islamic belief, but not blood, on Turkish culture, and on a shared Ottoman past. Now, none of these are geographically fixed within Turkey's 1923 borders. So rather than the narrow Kemalist focus on Turkey's borders and racial unity, both of them continually under threat by outsiders, Muslim nationalists imagine the nation as having more flexible boundaries based on a common Ottoman history and an imperial past as a world power. Indeed, Turkey imagines itself, as in Ottoman times, to be leader of the Muslim world. Now, this created quite a different understanding of Turkish national interests. The new Turkey imagines its influence extending far beyond its geographic boundaries. As a geostrategically central player, rather than a poor cousin on Europe's periphery. Now, nationalism remains the touchstone of Turkish identity. The big difference is that Muslim nationalism puts religion above the nation. This means that fellow Sunni Muslims of other nationalities could be welcomed into the nation, regardless of their ethnicity. And outsiders could come in and buy citizenship, purchase natural resources and national industries. Unthinkable under Kemalism. The situation is awash in contradictions. The polls, for instance, show no decrease in high levels of intolerance toward outsiders and people who are different. So the ruling party and the population are not necessarily always on the same page. Over time, the AKP became more conservative and religious, with an emphasis on the performance of piety as a marker of group membership, even if you're not really pious. You know, it's how you identify who is with you, who is against you, and therefore where money and obligations should flow. But here's another possible contradiction. What it means to be Muslim has largely been defined in Turkey by both the political, but also the market forces that were unleashed after the 1980s. Islam is faith, but also a lifestyle choice with its own fashion, leisure, music, media, and publishing realms that in many ways mirror secular society. So, you know, there's a question as to how Islam has shaped the identity of Turkish youth, regardless of how the AKP has tried to shape it through youth camps and programs that aim to create a population steeped in Islamic ethics and loyal to the party. There are many other forces at work. So just to answer the question I started with, since 1923, there have been drastic changes in what Islam means as part of Turkish identity, from a rather passionless complement to racial unity within these fixed borders, to a supranational identity that revives imperial fantasies. Each permutation has reshaped society, politics, and foreign policy in dramatic ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny White. That was a really fantastic, like I said, table setting for this conversation, because I'm so happy that you ended on this point of like paradox and contradiction and tension, because I think it sets up what Sebnem is going to tell us very, very well. I mean, in a way, the story you tell is one of you know, at least up until the arrival of the AKP in the early 2000s, one of you know, increasing incorporation of pious Muslim groups into the democratic framework of Turkey. And you could say this is a story of, you know, increasing representation and increasing democratization. However, the story over the last 2 decades is one of, despite that incorporation into the democratic framework that Turkey, you know, has set up for itself, distinct, clear, inarguable, and steep democratic backsliding. And so I want to turn to Sebnem now to help us understand why this happened and what you've observed in the process. Sebnem, please.
Well, thank you so much, James and Jenny, for that wonderful introduction and table setting. I'll do my best to be as short as possible, but the story is a long one and there are lots of details, but I don't want to take anything away from Hannah's remarks, and I'll do my best to be as brief as possible, but also at the same time give us some foundational understanding of what happened under the AKP. So I want to talk about how the AKP actually eroded and break down Turkish democracy. Just a quick recap following on Jenny's remarks. Turkey is, for those of you who don't know much about the country, is a middle-income country for some time now. And as Jenny beautifully summarized, it was established as a secular republic that had an interesting relationship with Islam in 1923. And for our purposes, for my purposes, it was also a kind of well-functioning democracy with multi-party elections after 1950. Perhaps also important for studies of democracy and democratic backsliding, Turkey maintained strong ties to the West for several decades. It has become a NATO member in 1952 and joined the EU accession line as a candidate state in 1999, and it still is pursuing EU membership as we speak today. But Turkish democracy has been somewhat turbulent, as Jenny also alluded to in her remarks. We have seen at least 2 breakdowns in the past. You can see this from the chart that I show. This is coming from VDEM Scores Electoral Democracy Index over the years. You can actually see Turkish democracy has started to pick up in 1950, but there was a breakdown with the first military intervention in 1960 and another major breakdown of democracy in 1980 intervention. Now I'm showing you guys a third arrow where we actually have a different type of democratic breakdown that does not necessarily come from the Turkish armed forces and their intervention in politics, but it's actually coming from an elected party that has come to power in free and fair election in 2002 and started to erode democracy somewhat very gradually at first, but then turned into a full-blown democratic breakdown after 2014 or 15, however you actually start that process. So, and then we see still Turkish democracy is not doing well by VDEM scores, and we also are in agreement as scholars that Turkish democracy is no more under the current government. So let me take this back to Erdogan a bit and connect all of this story to his rise to power. He actually becomes the prime minister in 2003, but his party wins the election in 2002, maintains the majority of the seats in the parliament. The system was parliamentary system at the time. He himself is coming from an urban, lower income from northern parts of the country, very much a conservative background and not so much educated. But we see his family migrating to Istanbul, a very much an urban, poor neighborhood. But Erdogan is quite an active young man in 1970s and 1980s. He actually becomes a very important figure in welfare parties' local branches at the time, and he wins the municipal elections in 1994. That marks his rise to the political stage as a very prominent actor in Turkish politics, and that becomes really solid with AKP, his party's rise to power in 2002. AKP has won successive national elections since then, and 6 national elections to be specific, 3 local elections and 2 or 3 constitutional referenda. 2 of them are really of critical importance. So that means a lot of success at the ballot box, and Erdogan has served as prime minister at first from 2003 on to 2014, and then he was elected as president in 2014 under the old system, and he was re-elected as the president of the new presidential system in 2018 and 2023. So that is about 23 years of uninterrupted rule, quite unique by democratic standards, and but is also very much marked by substantial support from the people. So this map actually shows us the latest elections in 2023, but the map pretty much looks pretty much the same when you go back to 2002 and see the electoral map of the country and trace it to today. Maybe 2 things that are important for our purposes to understand Turkish politics right now. AKP has been the only national party that can win votes and seats and compete with other rival parties across the country. So it competes with the secular CHP in the West, the red shaded areas, or it competes with pro-Kurdish parties in the east, the purple shaded areas. And then we also have the more minor right-wing parties like MHP, nationalist MHP, but Erdogan was able to defeat most of those right-wing parties anyway, and later he started to co-opt them into his larger coalition, ruling coalition, since maybe 2016, 2017. So this is very much a picture where we have the AKP dominating the entire political scene since its establishment, and the opposition being basically regional, ideological, and largely divided or fragmented around the country. So I want to argue that AKP's electoral success at the ballot box actually enabled democratic backsliding in the country through several different means. First of all, of course, successful electoral results actually gave the party a very strong popular mandate, and Erdogan a very strong popular mandate, which kind of allowed him to rule with a majoritarian tendency, basically self-portraying as the embodiment of the nation and the will of the people. And that success at the ballot box also helped him redesign the entire political system to the party's liking, especially to his liking. And here we can think about 3 separate constitutional referenda, especially the ones in 2010 and 2017, basically redesigned the entire system. First, redesigned the judiciary in 2010, and then redesigned the entire political system, shifted away from parliamentary politics to a presidential system that is highly centralized and very weak checks and balances. So with the support of the people, we actually see Erdogan redesigning entire Turkish politics and taking it away from somewhat of a well-functioning democracy to a highly centralized authoritarian regime. And the interesting part here for us is actually all that political success that indeed, or electoral success that indeed sustained over the years, also yielded or gave popular legitimacy of his authoritarian practices. So it did not only give him power to pursue his authoritarian agenda or centralization of power, but it also gave him significant legitimacy as he maintained that authoritarian streak. You may ask the question, how has he actually subverted democracy? What were the individual steps that he actually taken to change the entire political system and turned it into an authoritarian regime? This is nothing really new or unique. In the Turkish case, we have seen a similar script followed by many autocratic leaders, and maybe you will pursue this in your other webinars in this year. When you look at Modi and other cases, this is really coming from an authoritarian playbook. Erdogan followed that, and he first captured independent agencies and regulatory agencies and tax authorities and courts, and also expanded their authority as he politicized and stacked these, packed these authoritarian or regulatory agencies that are supposed to be independent with his loyal supporters. That captured courts and regulatory agencies and tax authorities, what have you, the state institutions played a very critical role in sidelining several important players in the political scene, from charismatic leaders like Selahattin Demirtas or more recently Ekrem İmamoğlu, to business people, including TÜSİAD chairman you see in these pictures, in these photos, and also important players in the media landscape. So former owners of media companies like Aydın Doğan, for example, was successfully sidelined using the tool of tax authorities and also using other forms of intimidation so that he would sell his newspapers and network stations to more AKP-friendly business people. I just put TÜSİAD here, which is a very recent example of how judiciary and law enforcement could be turned into a weapon to wield against potential rivals. TÜSİAD directors. TÜSİAD is a very prominent business association in Turkey, the oldest business association in Turkey, pretty much contributing the largest share to Turkish GDP. And 2 directors actually had speeches a few weeks ago, and they were very much highly critical of Erdogan government and his performance and declining institutions and rule of law in the country. And Erdogan was furious, and as soon as he actually made some remarks critical of TÜSİAD, saying that there was no role whatsoever for these people and their, remarks in the new Turkey. We have seen they were taken into custody by Istanbul prosecutor's office, and they were given. They were later released, but they were given travel bans, and there's still an ongoing investigation about their remarks. And if I'm not mistaken, they're accused of spreading false information because they were critical of the government. And this is just a kind of, a few examples that we can talk about, but we see an overall trend of sidelining potential rivals to Erdogan's leadership, within and outside of his party, of course. And then we actually have the electoral field pretty much manipulated. I just mentioned the media landscape, but campaign finance is extensive, and it's very much in favor of the AKP government. And electoral councils also make very important decisions that are questionable, that indeed overturn election results every now and then. We can talk about these details in the Q&A. I want to finish with two points. So you can ask the question, this leader is blatantly authoritarian, has become more and more authoritarian and putting so much pressure on different actors. Why would the people, keep voting for him? And I want to highlight two factors here that indeed change saliency over the years. First set of factors is obviously economic. So Erdogan had a very good performance in improving public services and maintaining macroeconomic stability for several years, perhaps until 2018, 2019. And he also expanded social assistance and welfare programs for urban poor, which is a typical AKP supporter, group of supporters. But that is pretty much the old story now with the economic downturn that Turkey now is going through. So political factors are taking over. And Janie did a very wonderful job in talking about this new Turkish national identity that the party has been cultivating. And on top of that, we can add that sense of polarization that Erdogan very skillfully infused. And there is the idea of there is no alternative to Erdogan. So we have Erdogan, who represents the real Turkish people with their piety and Islamic sentiments. And then the opposition is basically un-Islamic and alien to the people, and they're basically enemies to Turkish national interests. And they have a sense of empowerment that accompanies this rise of Islamic populism, and a very strong sense of loyalty that comes from 23 years of uninterrupted rule and all the benefits that they actually maintained and received over the years. I'm going to stop here. I don't want to take too much time. Perhaps we can continue the conversation later on during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sebnem. Again, a fantastic overview of the past 2 decades and the factors that kind of lead us up to where we are today. Turning to Hannah, first, I also neglected to mention that Hannah has a new book coming out that was just acquired, and the title, I don't know if it's provisional or not, but it's called Hinterlands, Journeys Through Europe's Unfinished Frontiers. And I'm led to believe it includes you're thinking about not only Turkey, but Turkey's near abroad in the Caucasus, in Syria, where it has been, a really major player in a lot of the reshaping, both the territorial and political formations, over the last several years. So turning to you and your perspective, Hannah, one thing that I think is important to note for our readers is, as Sebnem detailed, we have seen, this sort of democratic backsliding happen at a moment or over a period of time where there were tons of elections, and we're actually at a really unique moment to have this conversation because it's been a year since we've had an election. The mayoral elections happened just almost exactly a year ago this week. There were presidential and parliamentary elections the year before that. We've seen 3 constitutional referendums. I mean, it was like an election every year for about a decade. And we don't have another election on the horizon yet, right? Yeah. So this is an unusual period in contemporary Turkish history. So maybe, if we can start maybe, understanding that context, and then sort of what do you see as sort of shaping where democracy's little green shoots might come out or not? We'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a journalist based in Turkey, it's really, really weird to have gone this long without an election or a referendum or something. And as you say, nothing on the horizon, because it feels in Turkey over the past decade as if we're in this constant election cycle, which is something I'll come to in a bit. It's something that Erdogan plays on very well. But also, it's one thing that when people are defending Erdogan or questioning his critics, they say, well, of course it's a democracy. Look, you have elections, your turnout's super high. Of course it's a democracy. But of course, one thing that Sebnem mentioned, which is extraordinary if we think about it, in 3 days' time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan will have been in power for 23 years. This is not normal in a democracy, right? Leaders usually last sort of 10 years, 23 years, first of all as prime minister, then as president. And the other extraordinary thing about that is that he's done that through elections which have never been internationally condemned. He's not done it through Syrian-style elections under Assad or Russian-style elections under Putin. He's done it under elections that have generally been accepted in the last sort of decade, particularly since 2015. If you look at the OSCE reports, they will say things like free but not fair. And this is very, very key. So we have here, the tension between a leader who increasingly at this point is an autocratic leader. I don't think there's any question about that. But the fact that he still tries to frame himself as a democrat. And I think we have to ask why, what's in it for him. One of the things, of course, is that Turkey is not a country like North Korea or like Russia at this point, or like Syria, that's kind of, a pariah state. It's very, very connected. As Jenny mentioned, I think in 1999 it became an EU candidate country, gets a lot of funding from that, even though it's not a full member. And it's connected in all sorts of ways with the financial systems of Europe particularly. So, Erdogan in one sense needed, I think less so these days, he needed to sort of keep this democratic veneer to keep on good relations with Europe. But also there's a sort of very Turkish context to that as well, which is that Turks are just incredibly proud of their democracy. And so I think, for Erdogan to just throw off the shroud of pretense of democracy would not go well for him. He knows that he has to keep up some kind of facade where he can keep presenting himself as democratic leader. Now, I think there's two things that we should look at. First of all, he is a skilled politician. We can't overlook this. And his real skill lies in his pragmatism. When people ask me to kind of compare Ataturk and Erdogan, Ataturk also was an autocratic leader. But I think the main difference is that Ataturk was a visionary leader. He had a vision of what he wanted Turkey to be, and that was what he was working towards. And you can argue about, his methods and whether they were the right methods. But, he had a vision. Erdogan, on the other hand, is a pragmatist. And we can break these 23 years down into certainly 3 eras. We're perhaps now entering a fourth. When he's played a very, very different kind of character as a politician and role on the world stage. The first one was when he first came to power, that first decade, or at least until about 2010, when he was really trying to present himself as this liberalizer. The mood was at that time of European expansion. You had the countries that used to be sort of in the Soviet sphere, democratizing, coming into Europe. Turkey was seen as a kind of, also a hope for Europe as well in certain quarters of Europe. And Erdogan was making the right noises and doing the right things about, settling the Kurdish issue, about quashing the power of the military, which had, that graph that Sebnem showed is so interesting. You just see the drops on the democratic index, exactly where the coups happened. So, trying to bring the military out of politics. And, that lasted until about 2010. And then really with the onset of the Arab Spring, I think Erdogan began seeing a different kind of role for himself, particularly when in those protest movements in the Arab world, you had groups linked to the Muslim Brotherhood rising up and sort of seizing the moment. Erdogan himself, of course, comes from a sort of very brotherhood flavored background. He's absolutely a fellow traveler of people like Mohamed Morsi, the former Egyptian president. And, you know, when those revolutions in their first kind of years were succeeding and they were displacing the old dictators, it really looked like Erdogan was going to take this major role in the new Middle East. And he started looking towards that. That sort of started crumbling around the time of the coup in Egypt in 2013. And Erdogan also started facing increasing problems at home and in his neighborhood, particularly the Gezi Park protests. And then in December 2013, also the scandal around gold dealing, which nearly brought down his government. And he started to move more towards being an old school nationalist politician. We saw this particularly after the 2015 elections. These were the first parliamentary elections in which the AKP did not take an outright majority of seats in the parliament. Erdogan, after recalling that election, had to go into coalition with the hardline nationalists in the parliament. And then we saw the start of the third era, which is this, you know, really kind of retreat to hardline Turkish nationalism. It's so different from his first years. You know, the breakdown of the Kurdish peace process, you know, moves against the Kurdish forces in Syria as well. And that worked to keep him in power again. Of course, also in that period, we had the coup, we had the new constitution coming in, which is what's allowed him to move from being prime minister to being president. Conveniently for Erdogan, there is a very sort of tricky clause in that new constitution. So the term limit is set at 2 terms. He's currently in his second term. But if the snap elections were to be called, if Parliament was to decide to call snap elections, he could actually go for another term. So what we're expecting now is that elections which are scheduled for 2028 probably will come a little bit earlier so that he can stand again. So he's now moving into this fourth era, which is an interesting one. The Kurdish peace process is back on the table. We had, of course, the statement from Öcalan and then the statement from the PKK coming in the past few weeks. And clearly, you know, he's trying to, you know, position himself again. He's trying to sniff the winds again and see what is going to happen, how he can position himself for these forthcoming elections. And he's been greatly helped in that by what's happened in Syria, notwithstanding, of course, the horrific violence of the past few days. But I was in Damascus last month, and the Turkish influence there is, I mean, you can feel it both in terms of the economy, in terms of politics. This is a really big card for him. So these are the sort of means, the fair means by which he plays. But then, of course, there are also the foul means as well. And Sebnem touched on a lot of these. There's, of course, the media takeover. You know, at this point, there are so few opposition outlets left. And in the past few weeks, there's been operations against journalists at Help TV, you know, channel linked to the CHP. Really, for me, the devastating thing is the complete death of investigative journalism in Turkey. The opposition outlets that are left are completely underfunded. They're sort of desperate for advertisers. They have no money to fund investigations. They end up being basically just foghorns for the other side, persuading nobody. So that's one thing that's happened. Of course, that helps him a huge amount around election times as well, not only in terms of getting his own voice out and those of his candidates in the campaigning period, but also when the votes are being counted. We've seen Anadolu Agency, the state news agency, completely under state control, sort of manipulating the way that they report the results coming in, to cutting off, you know, the results early, these kind of things. Also, the institutional takeover, you know, things like the election board, the justice ministry, particularly after the 2016 coup attempt and the purge that followed, divide and rule of his political opponents. So we saw particularly, you know, over the past few years, every time the CHP and the Kurds started really coming together, Erdogan would maybe launch a military offensive in Syria, you know, really sort of force those differences. And just, you know, one thought I want to leave you with that demonstrates how successfully Erdogan has played this game of taking his country into autocracy while still presenting himself as a democrat. Over the past 3 or 4 months, there's been an escalating crackdown on the remnants of opposition in Turkey, both political. So we've seen the arrest of mayors from the CHP and from Dem, the Kurdish party, against journalists, against organisations like TUSİAD, as Sebnem mentioned. There has been zero international condemnation of this. This is astounding. 10 years ago, there was at least condemnation, or we would have, people like the Brits saying, okay, we make our case behind closed doors and we try to keep it friendly. Now there's none. And, it was really, it kind of hit home for me when I met a newly arrived European diplomat quite recently. And he'd come from somewhere that's not too democratic itself, but he was astounded. He said, I've been looking into what's going on here. Why is nobody saying anything? Now, is it a case that Erdogan is playing this really well? Is it a case that we're all just so used to it and it's not newsworthy anymore? Is it a case that, international relations has become increasingly transactional and will become more so because of Donald Trump basically pulling the US out of the Atlantic Alliance? Turkey is increasingly becoming a more and more important country, and Erdogan knows that. But I think, that's something that we should all think about when we're thinking about Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This is a really great point to end on, and unfortunately, I think quite a dark one. You mentioned, we are at a point where repression of dissent and repression of the media is hitting a new low in Turkey. I just read this morning that one of the last independent English language news sources based in Turkey, Duvar Media, has closed its doors. We've seen the closing of independent radio stations and so forth. But I think some of us, or many outside observers, might have assumed this was all gone years ago, but no, it has kept up. It has kept up. There has been this steady and consistent pressure and quadrant of dissent, if you want to say, within Turkey throughout this entire period. Erdogan himself does not actually command a majority, of the country, even in elections. It's been through alliances, right? Most recently, or in the most recent, suite of elections with the MHP, the far right nationalists. So I want to turn, maybe to a few, questions here, and I welcome everyone in the audience to put questions into the chat, and I'll review them in a moment. We'll put them back to our panelists. I think if we can start, though, perhaps we can sort of point out a few things that are happening right now that are really important for people to pay attention to who are interested in this question of Islam, nationalism, and democracy in Turkey. I mean, we are at a moment, as Hannah said, where geopolitics seems to have broken Erdogan's way fantastically well, right? Not only in Syria, but also in Ukraine and in the United States. All of this works or falls nicely. But none of it was guaranteed even a year or two or three ago. I mean, the man has been extraordinarily lucky in his political career, in addition to being pragmatic and skillful. I mean, I don't know if I should turn to Hannah or Sebnem or Jenny first, but whoever wants to take it up first. Seeing what's happened in Syria with the fall of Assad, who has been a bête noire for Erdogan since 2011, and the rise of Hayat Tahrir Sham, and also the sort of more directly Turkish-sponsored rebel groups, and the recent incorporation of the Syrian Kurds into the Syrian National Army, which was the deal that I think Hannah referenced, that was announced a couple of days ago. This is all very much to his liking. What do you think this particular development spells for Erdogan's ability to continue consolidating, his position within Turkey? Whoever wants to take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'm overstating it. I think it's almost a triumph of Turkish diplomacy what's happened in Syria. This is not to put a sort of value judgment on who's come to power and what's happened since, but it was very, very clear from the off that Turkey had a massive hand alongside some other countries as well, including Qatar and including perhaps Britain as well. But, in terms of the rebranding of Ahmad al-Sharaa, who 5 years ago was wearing, a turban and, dodging drone strikes in the mountains of North Syria. But the pressure on him to kind of reform Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, into this sort of more Turkish style version of Islamism. Of course, nothing like the Turkish state, but more kind of, Shara has been talking about tolerance, etc., etc. And, just the amount of influence, as I said before, that Turkey now has on this new government in Syria. Just looking at the kind of appointments in Shara's transitional government, the foreign minister, until he became foreign minister, was doing his PhD at a Turkish university. All the governors, district governors that have been appointed have come directly from the Syrian National Army, which was the Turkish-backed part of the rebel forces, separate to HTS. All these links are huge, and I think it's just a matter of time before we see Erdogan, going to the Umayyad Mosque for Friday prayers. I think it will happen in either Eid or in Ramadan. Now, there's both the kind of practical influence that brings. Turkey's very, very interested in bringing pipelines through Syria. It was something it was talking about actually even before the Syrian war broke out. So that's one thing. Of course, also as a market for Turkish products, also as they're in Damascus, in the Souk al-Hamadiyya, you now have Turkish ülke confectionaries and things like that. They said traders said they were bringing them in 2 weeks after Assad fell. In construction, just huge contracts to be won, and already there are trade fairs being held in Damascus over the next few months. There's Turkish instructors lining up to go in there. But also it's the kind of symbolism of it. Ever since Erdogan broke his relations with Assad right at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, he had this kind of dream of, praying in the Umayyad Mosque. It's for a Sunni Muslim leader who has put so much of both of his domestic and international image, particularly, Erdogan is very concerned about his image amongst global English-speaking Muslims. So a lot of what TRT does is very, very focused on sort of presenting Turkey and Erdogan as this, center and bastion and protector of Sunni Muslims around the world. So, the symbolism of that for him is going to be, it's something that he's going to play off for a long time. Same as, when he led the prayers in Hagia Sophia after he converted it into a mosque, he was, using that in election campaign videos for a very long time. So I think it works on those two levels for him.
And maybe Sebnem, if you could, I would love to hear you speak to sort of the sort of clientelistic and economic aspects of this as well, because this is a huge, I think, part of why Turkey, not a rich country to begin with, nonetheless stands to gain tremendously from the events in Syria.
Certainly, I agree with Hannah's points. So there are many pluses for Erdogan, and he has been tremendously lucky, as you said, James. But there are certain things in Turkey that he cannot necessarily fix right away. So economic downturn, especially high levels of inflation that the government could not decrease for several years now, is hurting a very specific group of people, especially pension holders and also minimum wage earners. They are in economic hell right now for several years, and it hasn't been really well for them. And I'm not sure if all of this foreign policy victories on the part of Erdogan would be able to fix some of these economic problems that people have, because it's not immediately kind of having an immediate impact and showing significant improvement over Turkey's macroeconomic stability. But that said, there's some patronage and clientelistic connections that Turkey will be, especially AKP government, will be benefiting from, with Syria turning into more stable, let's say, quote unquote, market for Turkish goods and Turkish businesses. But that is pretty much what the government has been relying on for some time. So yes, that will keep certain clients in the fold and will help Erdogan from the business people who have been waiting for this moment for some time. But when it comes to, again, pension holders and minimum wage earners, I'm not sure they will have a lot to gain from these developments in Syria and beyond. So perhaps going back to the symbolism of it all and the way that Erdogan is such a skillful propagandist when it comes to these symbolic gestures and wins, it may buy the government some time, right? So they may actually say, okay, perhaps we should just wait for another term, a few months. So whatever's going to happen with the Kurdish issue and Syria will give us more, better economic prospects. If that is the case, if Erdogan can pull that off and spread that message quite successfully, perhaps it's going to be to his benefit, but I'm not really that hopeful when it comes to this economic downturn and the increasing inequality between the poor and the rich. The rich is so much richer right now because of the inflation, and the poor is so much poorer.
Yeah, thank you, Sebnem. And Jenny, if I could actually ask you to take a spin on this that connects to your most recent book, Turkish Kaleidoscope. I mean, one of the incredible things that I've ever read coming out of Turkey in the last couple of weeks was Abdullah Öcalan's statement, and how he justified, and a call to disarm the PKK. And Öcalan is a figure that came out of the same period that you covered in Turkish Kaleidoscope. The PKK itself has these roots in sort of a Maoist Marxist radical group and the same street fighting that you mentioned and covered in that book. Perhaps you can maybe tell us a little bit about how you see that transformation, over time, and what that might mean for what's to come between Turkey and the PKK.
Can you tell me what in the letter, Öcalan's letter, you're particularly referring to?
Well, it's funny. To put it, maybe a bit too pithily, the letter really read less like he had been reading Mao or even Murray Bookchin that he was quite familiar with in the early 2000s in prison, but rather Francis Fukuyama. It was a very end of history type statement. The grand struggle between left and right is over. We have to incorporate into the Turkish state and so forth. These are astonishing statements for given his own personal history and trajectory. So I was curious how you saw that particular transformation.
Well, I'm not really sure, because some of this has to do with a man who's been incarcerated for such a long time and who really wants to get out. I mean, there was this joking reference to finding him a bride when he gets out, that take him in as the son-in-law. So I'm not sure that represents the PKK. And I'm not sure anything in particular, like one thing represents the PKK, which has been around for so long. I mean, we in Sweden, have a PKK presence there, in Germany, and the ones in the youth in Diyarbakir might be thinking quite differently from the people still in the mountains of Iraq. So I think there are many PKKs at the moment, running under different assumptions. Some of them, have just been abroad for so long. So it's, in Sweden, there's a criminal element to this also, that, once the PKK lays down its arms, I mean, what will remain if there's ideology has disappeared? So I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. I do want to say something about what Sebnem and Hannah were saying. To me, follow the money is always a wise thing when it comes to Turkey. So it's one of the the corruption has reached an incredibly high level, sort of unheard of even in Turkey. So at some point, the networks around the AKP are very, very dense, and they need to be fed. So, when you run out of property to give them, so they can build on, and you run out of, things that can be expropriated and given to, your loyal followers, how do you keep these people on your side, as Sebnem mentioned? I mean, you have to feed them something. And so Syria is the perfect example of this. And I just remember that there was a time when it was, really dangerous and illegal to say the word Kurdistan in Turkey, referring to Iraq, right? But what is there now? There's something called Kurdistan, and the head of the Kurdistan region is comes to Ankara, and the entire region has been, from what I understand, I haven't been there myself, but everyone says it looks like Turkey. Hannah, you will know. That there are Turkish businesses everywhere, and the same thing will happen to Syria. So this feeds the wolf, so to speak, sitting in the position of power, or the wolf's tribe, if you will. So I'm not sure. So I agree with Sebnem that the big image problem that he has is one. Yes, now he can keep his his network fed, but what about the rest of the country? His image so far has been as the patriarch of the Turkish family, and that is a concept that is incredibly powerful in Turkey. Even youth, there was I remember there was a poll that asked, or with interviews that asked Turkish youth, maybe about 10 years ago, do you think Turkey should join the EU? And some, over 50% said yes. So they went and interviewed the ones who had said yes, and it turns out that they have sort of second thoughts because they're not sure what will happen to the family, the Turkish family, the authority of the father, that this might be destroyed. So it's an incredibly powerful image. During Kemalist times, the state, it wasn't a person, it was the state, it was the Devlet Baba, it was the state father, who was almost like, imagined to be a person. And now there is actually a person, but the Devlet Baba, the patriarch, is supposed to take care of the family and protect the family. So this is what Erdogan plays on to cover up the fact that he's not feeding the family, at least not all of the family. So for instance, he would say, well, see, Syria, it's fine now, and we can move out the Syrian refugees, which he brought in, but the population didn't like, who they thought that they were stealing their jobs and pulling down wages. So there's always something that I'm doing for you, protecting you, helping you, and that becomes the issue to cover up the fact that there is this massive economic problem. And I can't help but think of the US constantly now when I read about Turkey. I just, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly on my mind here just outside of Philadelphia. We're unfortunately pretty short on time, but I'm hoping we could squeeze in one more question if it's all right with you. We have gotten several into the Q&A box, and I think we've actually covered or answered many of them in the course of our Q&A. But there was a question about the role of social media in the landscape of traditional media having broken down. I've noticed this myself as an avid social media user over the last 10 or 15 years. It has been one of the ways to really kind of get around censorship, but perhaps has also some really important limits on fighting back against democratic backsliding. So if any of you have maybe like a quick response to what social media is like, today in Turkey, and what role you think it plays, we can maybe close on that.
maybe I can start. Two things. I agree that social media has tried to fill that void that is left by media takeover. But I'm not sure if it's really successful for a number of reasons, because we have algorithms and whatnot, but also the government pressure over social media users. So many websites are shut down repeatedly, and then social media accounts are also suspended if they actually criticize the government or Erdogan. Many of these accounts are not accessible, for example, from Turkey. So there's significant pressure over social media users, but there's also some hope coming from social media, interestingly, especially when it comes to rule of law and law and order issues. If certain criminals are released and they commit crimes and whatnot, especially when it comes to children and women and violence against them, social media can exert substantial influence and pressure as a manifestation of public voice. And that kind of every now and then turns certain things around. But I'm not sure this is a good outlet for Turkish opposition, because, we have echo chambers, and it's not the best way of reaching skeptical voters or loyal supporters of Erdogan. There should be other ways in which they can actually build those connections, and the opposition should actually find them. They should not rely on social media. I don't think that's a safe bet.
Mm-hmm. Hannah or Jenny, any final thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think social media is important, and I think a sign of that is the fact that the government then cracked down on social media. Starting from, I think, 2021, they started introducing laws about so social media companies have to set up offices in Turkey with representatives who are answerable to the courts, and they have to agree to take content down and blah blah blah blah. So and disgustingly, the social media companies signed up to it. So, and we've also had a case of Elon Musk's Twitter, or X, very happily sort of taking down things on Turkey's behalf. So I don't think we can't rely on social media. I think now the world's just coming to realize that actually, the people who control social media also have their own, agendas. And yeah, so I think we possibly have to think of different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps more informal ways, who knows, of getting around these things. Jenny, please. Oh, you're muted again, sorry.
I thought we could round it out with another reference to the Ottoman Empire.
Sure, go ahead, please.
I was thinking, one of the ways in which the AKP, which now runs so much of the media, keeps people happy despite everything, is through all of these films about the Ottoman Empire, which he then sort of mimics in his the paraphernalia around him, and the raising the Turkish flag on Aleppo and so on. So this national pride that we were this great nation that is constantly sort of fed to the population now with rituals, public rituals, and so on. So I think that's one of the ways in which he will try to cover up the fact that people are not able to pay their rent and have enough to eat.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point to end on, and to realize that this is a culture war as much as anything else, and one that appears at least in traditional media, Erdogan is winning. Charlie, Michael, thank you so much for again hosting us here. I want to thank Sebnem, Jenny, Hannah for some really fantastic presentations and conversations. I love having these conversations, and I hope you all keep following with everything RSAA is doing, and check this out and share it on YouTube when it comes up.
just to say a big thank you to you, James, as well for moderating today's event, and again to all the panelists. And just to say that the next RSA event is on the 2nd of April, and it will be a film screening of the new Amu Darya River to a Missing Sea, which explores the oral history of the disappearance of the Aral Sea over the last 70 years or so. So that, if you're interested in that, the details are on the website, and we look forward to seeing you there. But again, just thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to James for moderating. It was a really interesting discussion.